Kardemummabullar. Cardamom infused buns that are one of the quintessential parts of the Swedish custom of Fika. If you haven't heard of Fika before, I could best describe it as a coffee break. But whereas coffee breaks are often viewed as procrastination of work, the Swedish really see the value in taking some time to have a cup of coffee and baked goods with your coworkers. They found that worker morale is up and workers are generally happier when you give them this moment to relax. But I thought that since these cardamom buns go so well with coffee, how would they go with a coffee infused stout? There's only one way to find out, and that's to make some cardamom buns on my own on this episode of Bacon to Brew. Of course, you can't have a cardamom bun without cardamom, so we're going to toast up some whole cardamom pods. This is probably way more than I need, but I don't mind having a little extra on hand. I'm just heating it up gently until it becomes fragrant. Now what I'm really interested in is the seeds, so I'm going to cover this with a towel and bash it with a rolling pin to open up the pods. Eventually realizing I need something heavier duty to crack all these open. And as you can see, you could easily peel back those pods to reveal the seeds within. Now if you're thinking there's no way I'm doing all that, it looks way too tedious, I completely agree. And I just throw it all into a spice grinder to crack open those shells. And then I'm going to pick out the big pieces of the pods. It's okay if I leave a little bit behind. In fact, the ground cardamom that you find at the store is likely ground seeds and pods. And I'll scoop up what I have into my spice grinder and then I'll grind this into powder. It's okay if you leave it a little coarse. I actually like to see those cardamom specks in the dough. I'll put this ground cardamom aside and we'll use it throughout the process. And now I'll move on to the dough where I'll weigh out 350 grams of bread flour. I'll then add 1 teaspoon of my ground cardamom, 1 teaspoon of salt, 35 grams of sugar, 2 teaspoons of instant yeast, and 200 milliliters of milk. I'll move this to my mixer. I'll mix this on low speed until everything starts to get hydrated, and then I'll slowly ramp up the speed. I'm going to mix this for a few minutes before adding the butter, since the butter could inhibit gluten formation. And then add 4 tablespoons of butter, just a little bit at a time until everything's fully incorporated. And I'll continue to mix this for 10 to 15 minutes or until the dough passes the window pane test. And this dough looks like it's just about ready. I'm just going to roll this around by hand to create some tension on the outside. Then I'll move into a clean bowl to allow it to rise for a couple hours until it's doubled in size. And at this point I realize I'm on a time restraint and won't be able to finish today, so I'm actually going to move it to a square container to better represent the eventual shape that I'm going to want the dough. And I'm going to move it into the refrigerator where the cold temperature could inhibit fermentation and allow it to rise slowly overnight. I'm just going to press this down to fill the container before covering with plastic wrap and moving to the refrigerator. The next day, after removing my dough from the refrigerator to allow it to come up to temperature, I'll start making my filling. I'm going to use 150 grams of dark brown sugar, along with 6 tablespoons of butter. I'll also add half a teaspoon of salt, 1 tablespoon of my ground cardamom, and 1 tablespoon of flour. That should help bond everything together and prevent it from leaking too much. And I'll mix this until it becomes nice and creamy. And now I'll roll out my dough. I'll generously flour my countertop and roll this out fairly thin. Changing direction every now and then, trying to form a really long rectangle. I'll give a tug on the corners every now and then, just trying to keep that rectangular shape. And then I'll start adding my filling. I want to cover about 2/3 of the dough, so I'm going to put some dollops on the dough before spreading it out. We'll try to make sure that everything's completely covered except for that top third of the dough. Once everything's spread thin, I'll fold down that top third, and then I'll take the bottom third and turn that back up, so that we have 3 distinct layers of dough. I'll flour my countertop again so I could roll this a little thinner. Again, we're looking for a long rectangle, so I'm going for about 18 to 22 inches in length. And I'll move this onto a cutting board so I could cut it into long strips. I seem to have forgotten to hit record when I actually cut it into strips, but just trust me, it ended up with 8 long strips. To shape these, I'm going to take each one individually and give it a twist. Then I'll wrap each one loosely around 2 fingers, 2 rotations, and then I'll change direction and wrap it around the other way before tucking the end over. I'll show that again. We'll give the whole thing a twist. And then wrap it loosely, 2 rotations around my fingers, and then wrap it around the outside and tuck it underneath. I'll move these onto a baking tray where I'm going to cover and leave the rice for another 45 minutes or so. Once these are fully proofed and noticeably puffier, I'll top with an egg wash before baking. At this point, it's common to top your buns with pearl sugar, which is a form of sugar that's compressed to prevent melting and allows it to hold its shape. There are 2 types, Swedish and Belgian. You're going to want the Swedish because the Belgian is larger and usually used for waffles. If you're wondering why I'm showing you the Belgian version, it's because I didn't know this when I ordered it. But I have other plans for finishing these when it's done. I'll bake these for about 12 minutes at 400 degrees. Once they finish baking, I'll transfer them to a cooling rack. And since I didn't have the pearl sugar, I'll take a lesson from my babka video and make a simple syrup and just brush the top of them to give them that shine. And it won't hurt to hit it with some extra cardamom, so I mix some of that ground cardamom with some granulated sugar, and I'll just dust that over top of them. And there you have it, Kardemummabullar, an essential part of Swedish Fika. Let's cut one of these open. I was worried how the overnight ferment will turn out, but these came out extraordinarily soft, and it's just loaded with cardamom flavor. Only thing left is to pair this with a cup of coffee, or better yet, a coffee beer. This is Founder's Breakfast Stout. It's an oatmeal stout infused with chocolate and coffee beans. Oftentimes when I come up with beer and food pairings, my first step is to find that hook, the flavor that both the food and the beer have in common and connects the two together. In this case, I'm just using flavors that complement each other so well. Cardamom and coffee is common not only in Swedish Fika, but also throughout the Middle East, where coffee is often brewed with cardamom. Now, I don't know a scientific reason why cardamom and coffee go so well together. I have a feeling that it has to do with that flavor of cardamom cutting through the bitterness and acidity of coffee, providing that balance. So it shouldn't be too much of a surprise if cardamom and beer pair really well together as well. Stouts in general would use roasted barley to give you that black color. So you get a lot of that coffee and chocolate-like flavor just from the roasted process. Founders adds coffee and chocolate to the beer as well to really take that roast character over the top. This beer is definitely on the sweeter side. I'm not getting a whole lot of bitterness out of it, just this really full-bodied, decadent mouthfeel. It really is the perfect beer to have with baked goods. In fact, this beer could even be considered a dessert unto itself. It's just a great after-dinner beer. And buns are so loaded with that cardamom flavor, it really adds to the beer drinking experience. Obviously, Kardemummabullar isn't your only option for Fika. The Swedish also make something called a kanelbullar, which is the same process but with cinnamon instead of cardamom. Cinnamon and cardamom have very different flavors, but they're used pretty much in the same way. So whenever I'm making something with cinnamon, I like to sneak a little cardamom in there too. I think it adds great depth to whatever I'm baking. And you could use any ratio between cinnamon and cardamom you would like with this. You could use all cinnamon, all cardamom, or any combination of the two. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and join me next time when I take another one of my favorite classic beers and try to bake the perfect pairing.